Thank you for listening to the Plain State Podcast, a production of the Department of English at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In this episode, Michael Page continues his conversation with James Gunn, who discusses meeting celebrated author Robert Heinlein and his own experiences as a young man coming of age during wartime and starting to write.
So Robert Heinlein was born in Kansas City, not far from where you were born in Kansas City, but he was about 16 years older than you. But you say you met Heinlein a few times over the years?
Yes, I think the first occasion I met him was at the Nebula Awards ceremony when he was presented with the first Grand Master Award. He was number one. And afterwards, in a reception they had for him, or meeting up in the SFW suite, I went up to him and congratulated him, sort of said, great to meet you, Mr. Heinlein. And he said, you can call me Robert. And then I had my closest contact with him actually on the telephone when he was going to be guest of honor at the World Convention in Kansas City in 1976. I had been named to the committee for the arrangements for the convention as the SFWA liaison. And then I got a call from Jerry Purnell, who said that Mr. Heinlein was running into difficulties with the organizing committee. They just don't seem to get along. And said, could you smooth this over? So I called Heinlein, or he called me, I forget. We had a series of conversations over the telephone about arrangements. He was a very formal man in a sense. He, as one might realize from reading his novels, he believed in a sort of patriarchal society in which people knew their places, and young people had the responsibility of honoring their seniors and listening to them, and seniors had the responsibility for educating the young people, enable them to make the transition into being reliable seniors. And as a matter of fact, when Heinlein said in the first conversation we had, he said, this committee keeps talking about, instead of doing an ordinary banquet, they want to do a insulting roast. Why would they want to insult me? And I said, these young people, they just don't understand. So I got in touch with them and got that quelled. And later on, I was going to, he was giving me instructions about how he wanted to be picked up and driven along with his wife down to the hotel, the Milwaukee Hotel, and that he needed to see his brother. And I said, well, maybe you can invite him down to the hotel. He said, oh, no. He said, I have to go and see him because he's the elder. He's a retired general, and he lives in a suburb of Kansas City. And that was the way it went generally, that he felt that there were obligations that people owed that they needed to take care of.
Some of that was sort of from his naval background correct?
Yes,
And
true.
you were a Navy man.
I was
in World War II.
Yes, I
Was
was
stationed in the Pacific
only after the war.
after the war.
However, yeah.
But didn't you read some science fiction while you were on Truck Island?
Yes, I did. I was after a month or two at Guam, in somewhere around sometime in the late autumn of
1945.
45, 44, I guess. I was transferred down to Guam as to serve as adjutant to the commanding general, which just meant that I was in charge of the mail. Didn't do much for the adjutant or the commanding, who was the Marine general. But among other things, one day a copy of Astounding came in to a Navy person who'd already gone back to the States.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps I committed a crime, but I could not resist the temptation of reading the magazine. And that was my first contact with my United States science fiction after the experience I had when I was still in the Naval Air Corps cadet. And I was transferred in my third 3-month session to the University of Georgia for pre-flight training, and went into Athens, Georgia, and in the drugstore there I found a copy of Donald Wollheim's Pocketbook of Science Fiction, which was a real revelation to me in lots of ways. The first real anthology of science fiction that I had seen. Some lesser anthologies have been published, but this was the real stuff. And
you read that on a train, didn't you, or you carried
yes,
it around?
Yes, that was always on the train, and generally very crowded. And although when we traveled from Las Vegas, New Mexico, to on a train to across southern states through Texas and Louisiana and other towns, we stopped briefly in El Paso and then in New Orleans briefly, but we arrived in Athens and got to the campus, and I still remember us being marched down through as new cadets and the campus, and the old cadets getting there almost finished, yelling out the windows, "Break, run for the hills, they can't catch you all." But then I was, after my 3 months there, they shipped me to Memphis, Tennessee, where the Navy had an air base, and they were going to try to train us to fly bi-wing airplanes, sort of like the Yellow Perils that you see in World War II. And I had been trained actually in New Mexico on single wing Aroncas, and I had learned to fly them there in Las Vegas, New Mexico. I had 50 hours of solo and thought I was really competent, but discovered that flying a yellow N3N, I think it was called officially, was a different matter entirely, because everything was reversed. And it turned out that on the day when I was supposed to bring in the aircraft for landing, it's been the spring of the year, and the wind had been blowing all year all month long, and on this occasion, this morning, the wind had stopped, and instead of coming in for a normal landing, that just sailed right across the tarmac without landing. And my co-pilot instructor took charge and made a circle with the airplane and brought me in again. And once more, the airplane sailed right across the tarmac.
Better that than an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, and because it didn't. And he said, that's why we've been practicing all this time, stalling out the airplane so it lands. I didn't know that, I guess. But anyway, they decided I was not intended to be a pilot. And I got washed out and sent to Great Lakes for 3 weeks for reassignment. Then to preparatory midshipman school in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where I experienced my first hurricane, which blew past right off the coast, but it raised lots of tide waves and tore up the boardwalk. We had quite an experience there, but then shipped on to Notre Dame, where I took more line officers training and some tests to determine what I was cut out to be. And they assigned me to learn Japanese, sent me out to Boulder, University of Colorado, to learn Japanese. But by the time, and then they shipped it at the end of 3 months down to Oklahoma State, which was then A&M, and now is Oklahoma State University. And after a month there, I decided the war was going to be over, and so I opted out, and they sent me to advanced line officers training at Miami, where I experienced my second hurricane. This one hit Miami. But I also experienced sitting in the Columbus Hotel where they housed us. They were getting rid of some of their excess liquors, and many of us spent our time there in the room. But I was sitting there when I heard the radio news that the atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, and I knew that the war was over. I also had all these images of atomic warfare, atomic bombs in my head from all the science section I'd been reading, and wondered if it was going to set the earth on fire.
Indeed.
And if so, how long it would take to reach Miami. But then the war indeed was shortly over, and they shipped me out to San Francisco for a while, and then from San Francisco on a hospital ship that were sending back out to the end of the Pacific on a very comfortable 2-week cruise to Guam.
So I imagine your wartime experience, like a lot of young men at the time. Not only did you go to the South Pacific, but you actually kind of toured the entire United States at
That's
that
true.
time, being sent from place to place.
I went to I don't know, more than half a dozen colleges and universities. They kept trying to teach me something, and I don't think they ever taught me anything.
And then when you returned from the war, did you immediately get back to school at the University of Kansas?
Yes, I had been called up at the end of my junior year, which was my first year at the University of Kansas. My brother had been in medical training at pre-med school at KU at the university, and my father, who was a printer, by trade never had a lot of money, was paying his tuition, couldn't afford to pay mine up there as well. So I had gone to, first of all, to Kansas City, Missouri Junior College, and then transferred to Kansas City, Kansas Junior College for my sophomore year because we had moved on the Kansas City, Kansas side of the state, so my father wouldn't have to pay out-of-state tuition. And so then my brother graduated and went on to medical school, which is at that time he was inducted into the Army, and the Army was paying for his expenses. So I went to KU, and I had already that summer volunteered for the Naval Air Corps, but I don't know, maybe it had their pipeline full or something, but they said I could go to university for a year. And I spent a year here in 1942, 43. Before in June, they called me up, and I went to my first college in Mount Vernon, Iowa. It was Cornell College, and sort of boot camp arrangement, but they put 25 pounds on me, so I guess that was okay. But then, so there was just a matter of every 3 months they would send me to someplace new, apparently to learn something else. I did learn to fly, sort of, and but everything else I've pretty much forgotten. I haven't flown since then, so.
And then after the war, you were here.
Yes, and then after the war, I decided
finished your undergraduate degree
to KU and picked up my senior year here as working as I came in, and the chair of the department said that offered me the job of editor-in-chief. There are a lot of returning veterans, but including some returning faculty members who had been called up also. But anyway, I was the editor-in-chief, which was mostly a matter of taking care of the editorial page. But in that first occasion, I came back in June and came up here shortly afterwards. The chair of the student board was called in to approve my appointment. It turned out, though she didn't remember it, it turned out that she was also in my editing class, and by the end of toward the end of the first semester, I had she said she kept looking at the back of my head, trying to get a message to me. So I finally invited her to attend a play with me, and we went to the play. But I had to leave her, taking a bus back to her home, because I had to go write a review.
And that was Jane.
That was Jane. So, and we dated for a month or two, and then she was going to graduate at the end of the fall semester, since she had taken some extra classes in the summer. And so she said, let's get married. So we got married in February, right while she was taking finals, February 7th. And when we returned, I had the GI Bill. We had a little extra money and graduated. Both walked down the hill in June. And the big event that had happened to me that year was I had taken a playwriting class from the grand old man of KU Theater, Alan Crafton. And during that class, I had written as my final assignment a 3-act play about the second coming of Christ. And he runs for president, gets defeated, crucified again. And Alan Crafton liked it so much that he put it on as part of the spring theater semester, though he had mostly students working on it, but it was the first student play that had been done there for a long time, if ever. And so I got the illusion that maybe I was cut out to be a playwright. Stayed in the summer and took a playwriting class. Actually, it was a directed study course, and wrote another play, also a science fiction play, which wasn't very good. But I, meanwhile, looked around for a university to attend, so I finally settled on Northwestern University because it had such a good reputation for theater. And I enrolled there in Northwestern, but I discovered that it only had one playwriting class, which was not very illuminating. And I spent most of my time painting scenery in the abandoned garage, which was in the depths of winter there in Evanston.
Mm-hmm.
But I did take a course in radio writing from a well-known professor named Martin Maloney. And decided, that was maybe what I was cut out to be. So I left Northwestern after 2 quarters and returned with Jane to...
Then she moved into Kansas City?
Kansas City. And I still had some Navy savings, and we rented a 3rd floor apartment, a sort of a garret, I guess, but it was sort of inspiring. And I took my concept for a radio series based on Kansas City history around to the radio stations, and none of them were interested. This was just before television was going to make its appearance there. And so I sat down and wrote my first science fiction story, a story called Paradox.
Jim, I was going to mention, too, on the way down here, I realized that this is the 70th anniversary of both Paradox and Communications, your other early story, both
That's
published in the November. One was November?
One was September and one was October.
October of
Communications, which the second story
was in Thrilling
I
Wonder.
wrote and sold, was actually the one published first. And
that one was that in Thrilling Wonder?
No,
or Startling.
Startling stories.
And then Paradox was in
and
Thrilling
Paradox was in Thrilling Wonder stories, but it was the one that I sent around. I sent first to Astounding, and John Campbell sent it back with a brief note, which but it was a personalized note, but it was a standard sort of personalized note. Said it was, could use it, keep writing. And then I sent to Amazing Stories, which just sent it back with a printed rejection slip. So I sent it to Thrilling Wonder Stories. And one day I got a letter from Sam Merwin Jr., the editor, saying, "I like your story, Paradox, and I'll pay you $80 for it." It was a life changer. Somebody would actually pay me to sit in front of my typewriter and turn the inside of my head into stories. So
you must have bought Communications shortly thereafter then?
And I wrote Communications. I must have tried it with different places. I've forgotten it. I did send it in to Sam Irwin. He bought it for Startling Stories. I must have made twice as much for it because it was
a longer story.
It was a longer story. But I only stole one more story that year, though eventually in subsequent years, after that first year, I decided that I was not going to make a living at this, and my savings were dwindling. I had saved up about $2,000 because, particularly when I was out on Guam, where there was nothing to spend money on, so my limited salary accumulated. And in a way, I remember turning to Jane at one point and saying, "There's an ad here, a story about a firm that's going to start up and make computers or something. Maybe we should invest my money in that." And I decided maybe we shouldn't. Its name was IBM. But instead, I sort of invested my savings in my career. After I at the end of that year, I decided I need to go back to school and get a master's degree, maybe be able to teach. And while I was there, I sold 6 more stories to some of the magazines that were popping up. There were new magazines coming along after World War II, new science fiction magazines, mostly because publishers thought that there'd be a big boom in science fiction because World War II had been so influenced by laboratory science, mostly in space flight, but also in other elements, including the atomic bomb. And so there was, at one point in the early 1950s, there were almost 50 different magazines being published. And so I managed to sell almost all of my earlier stories, and everything else I was able to write. But then in the middle of the 50s, there was an implosion of all these magazines. They stopped publishing, including some of the older ones like Thrilling Wonder Stories and Startling Stories, till there were only half a dozen magazines left. And it was difficult for writers and so forth at that time. So I had, after getting my master's degree at KU in 1951, I had been hired by Western Printing and Lithography Company.
A publisher of Dell books, correct?
He was a company in Racine, Wisconsin, which published Dell books as well as, although they didn't sell them except to the Dell company. They just would do all the work on choosing and editing and printing them. Then they would sell them for 8 cents a copy to Dell, and Dell would distribute them. But this also was true of Little Golden Books, but they had some comics that they printed, and little big books, and playing cards, and even some Whitman Publishing company of their books of their own. So
the Whitman was part of the Western.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you know Whitman?
Yeah, they did a lot. They did a lot of children's books.
Yeah,
children's hardback books of
sorts, and the Little Golden Books, which are very big.
Sort of story books.
Simon and Schuster was for Simon and Schuster. But eventually, it turned out that I did edit a couple of science fiction books while I was there, but mostly I did other things.
One of them was
edited a joke book called
Funny Side Up.
Funny Side Up, which I didn't get my name on.
But it's attached to your name's attached to it now, courtesy of the book I wrote about you.
Yes, that's true. People know who put it together. It was a fun time. I would be reading and researching jokes and cartoons and so forth for it, and I'd come home and tell these stories to Jane.
Special thanks to James Gunn and Michael Page. Plain State is produced by Robert Lipscomb. Post-production by Stephen Ramsey. Music by Shadows on a River. My name is Monica Uspin. On behalf of the Department of English at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, thank you for listening to the Plain State Podcast. Tagline forthcoming.